Last week, we examined the beginning of World War II and saw how German troops crushed the Polish, Danish, Norwegian, Dutch, Belgian and French armies one by one. We also evaluated the Soviet reactions to all of these campaigns. This week, we will study the German war plans and preparations for Operation Barbarossa. Welcome to video 11 in our prelude to the Kings and Generals Weekly Eastern Front of World War II series. Let's begin with Hitler's decision to invade the Soviet Union and why it was made. This series dives deep into complex and often sensitive historical topics that may not always align with YouTube's guidelines, so your support is essential. By becoming a member or patron, you're helping keep this project alive and ensuring we can continue delivering high-quality content to our viewers without worrying about demonetization. Our members and patrons have early access to the next 6 episodes. Become one by pressing the join button under the video or via the links in the description and pinned comment, and gain access to future Eastern Front videos and 200 other exclusive episodes. In December of 1940, Hitler signed War Directive 21. This order declared that the Army and Air Force should start preparing for an invasion of the Soviet Union. He acknowledged that this would likely have to occur before the war with Britain was ended conclusively. The directive also laid out a rough strategic vision for the invasion. The army would be expected to advance on a line from the Baltic to the Black Sea, while aiming for a destruction of the bulk of the Red Army and capturing Leningrad. This early draft envisioned that a drive on Moscow would be contemplated only after this first objective was completed. Hitler also made clear that he did not intend to advance beyond a line he roughly contemplated as running from Arkhangelsk in the north to the Volga in the south. This was an incredible task in its own right, a distance of 2,000 kilometers from the starting point of the army. The already vast starting front, which was 1,400 kilometers wide, would expand to over 2,100 kilometers when the campaign ended. Clearly, War Directive 21 was proposing a campaign without comparison in military history. This would be the most ambitious plan ever put into the field. Ambitions aside, the campaign's planning highlighted severe issues within the Wehrmacht from the beginning. Not least of these was the difference of strategic vision between Hitler and his generals at the OKH. The chief of the Army General Staff was Colonel General Hellyer. A loyal supporter, he felt that Hitler was mistaken and misled in his strategic vision for how to conquer the USSR. Hitler believed that the destruction of the Red Army must take priority in any campaign, followed by the seizure of the vital industrial and agricultural centers of Ukraine. Hellyer felt strongly that the Wehrmacht should focus on driving to take Moscow first and then negotiate to get the economic and industrial potential Germany needed for a long war in the West. More than just tactical considerations, it was fundamentally a different vision of the campaign in the East. These differences meant that while Hitler ordered one campaign plan drawn up and prepared for, Hellyer and his subordinates instead committed only half-heartedly to Hitler's orders and worked to set the stage for the adoption of their plan. They wagered this would be possible after the first major victories of the campaign and would convince Hitler of the wisdom of their plans. There were other fundamental issues for the Wehrmacht's campaign in the East. The sorry state of equipment standardization was a major issue that affected everything from the strength of fighting units to logistics planning. In the build-up for the operations, Hellyer's staff counted that the Heer was being equipped with no less than 150 models of trucks manufactured by German industry. Many of the trucks that formed the backbone of the logistics arm were civilian models that had been requisitioned in order to keep the mobility of the panzer and motorized forces during the campaigns in Poland and France. This menagerie of vehicles meant that no comprehensive storage of spare parts could be built up, which had implications for the longevity that could be expected for the trucks as they were exposed to the harsh conditions of the 1,200-kilometer march to Moscow. Even the panzer divisions, the elite of the Heer, had little to no uniformity. They had been reduced in size in order to form the core of new divisions with the same amounts of men and equipment. In May of 1940, the 10 panzer divisions had averaged 256 tanks in each division. By June of 1941, there were 20 panzer divisions. However, their average strength had been diluted to just 190 tanks. Maybe of even more importance than the average strength, the strongest divisions in 1940 were the 3rd, 4th and 5th Panzer. Each of these had over 300 tanks. In 1941, the 3 strongest divisions were the 6th, 7th and 20th Panzer, of which only one had more than 250 tanks. This dilution of the critical arm of the Wehrmacht was seen as necessary in order to provide breadth of coverage across the enormous front contemplated by Operation Barbarossa. This was accomplished, but at the significant cost of reducing the striking power of the panzer divisions. There was some silver lining to this restructuring. Many of the now decidedly obsolete Panzer I and Panzer II tanks were being replaced with more modern tanks. Some of these were the Czech-built PZ-35T and PZ-38T, but many were Panzer IVs and IIIs. Approximately 700 of the new Panzer III were Ausführung Fs with the new 5cm gun. This weapon had much improved armor penetration. It would be effective against the lighter Soviet tanks the Heer would encounter in the east, and an overall much-needed improvement to the older models. However, the mix of tank models would plague the war effort in the east. As the distances between the frontline troops and the industrial base of the Nazi war machine would grow, bringing the incredible variety of spare parts needed for these models to the divisions would become increasingly arduous. Logistics planning for Operation Barbarossa revealed serious problems that had only been minor issues for the campaigns in the West. The standardization issues with the trucks we mentioned before played a part in this, but pure numbers were an issue as well. The Heer had a serious shortfall in trucks as early as February of 1940, and this would only get worse, as German industry was only replacing about half of the losses. Requisitions from civilians and captured stocks only complicated the standardization problems, while only providing temporary relief to the issue of replacement. To make matters worse on the outlook for logistics planners in 1941, Soviet railroads ran on a wider gauge track than the rest of Europe. There were only two possible solutions to this issue. Either the Germans would have to capture large amounts of Soviet rolling stock and locomotives, or the tracks would have to be relayed to the narrower European standard. The first was an issue of operational luck that could not be predicted due to the fog of war. The second would require large amounts of manpower and time. The actual plans and troop dispositions for the invasion of the Soviet Union went through three major planning phases. The first phase was an operational study by Major General Marcks. His planning received official sanction on July 29, 1940, well before Hitler issued his War Directive 21. This plan called for two army groups, one north of the Pripyat marshes and one south. The Northern Army Group would be the far stronger group and the main effort of the campaign. Marcks estimated the Red Army's available strength on its western front as 96 infantry divisions, 23 cavalry divisions, and 28 motorized brigades. Interestingly, he did not seem to know about the existence of the Red Army's tank divisions or the mechanized corps. To meet this strength, Marcks used numbers that included the planned continued expansion of the Heer to give him 147 divisions for his operation. These included 110 infantry, 1 cavalry, 24 panzer, and 12 motorized infantry divisions. The Northern Army Group would receive 50 infantry, 1 cavalry, 2 motorized, and 15 of the panzer divisions. The Southern Group would get 5 panzer, 6 motorized, and 24 infantry divisions. The remainder would form a large operational reserve to help fill in gaps as the front expanded as the army groups advanced into the Soviet Union. Marcks divided his operational concept into 4 phases. The first phase would have the army groups pushing the Red Army back approximately 400 kilometers, while hopefully encircling the bulk of their forces. If this failed, the second phase would be another attempt to break the new defensive lines and encircle the defenders across a distance of anywhere between 100 and 200 kilometers. These 2 phases would take no more than 7 weeks. If the initial operations failed to achieve their goals, Marcks acknowledged that positional warfare and insecure lines of communication would be the result. Red Army units that could not be cleanly surrounded and broken would eventually dissipate the strength of the invasion force. The scattered Soviet soldiers could threaten supply lines and require dedicated attention by larger units in order to destroy them. The third phase of operations called for a simultaneous advance through eastern Ukraine and the capture of Moscow and Leningrad. This was an ambitious concept, and Marcks made clear that this would be contingent on the success of the first 2 phases, as well as a strong logistics picture. The final phase was even more ambitious, and involved pushing on a broad front from Arkhangelsk to Rostov in the south, with Gorky as the easternmost limit in the center. Marcks also put together a geostrategic analysis of the German situation following an invasion of the Soviet Union. He noted that an immediate alliance between the United Kingdom and the Soviet Union would be unavoidable. This would also result in economic aid from the United States, who was already deeply committed to the UK. Additionally, Marcks was insightful enough to tell his superiors that the Western Allies would have the opening they needed to land in Europe and begin fighting to liberate their fallen compatriots. Germany would not be able to fight on 2 fronts. In order to remedy this, Marcks emphasized that the Wehrmacht must defeat the Soviet Union quickly. This could not be guaranteed, but he made clear that taking Moscow was the key. In this, he was echoing his friend Hellyer, who was at this moment trying to convince Hitler of this exact course of action. At any rate, the plan represented an incredible task for the 17-week schedule laid out by Marcks. However, it was not the most ambitious plan concocted by the Wehrmacht for the invasion of the Soviet Union. That dubious honor goes to the next plan we will look at, the one prepared by Lieutenant Colonel Lossberg. This study was conducted concurrently with the one by Marcks. Unlike Marcks, Lossberg was operating under the auspices of Colonel General Jodl, the Chief of Staff for the OKW. This plan was similar to Marcks in some aspects, but was different in 3 ways. First was his division of the field army into 3 army groups rather than 2. This proved to be an enduring change. Unfortunately, an exact order of battle is hard to come by, and it is unclear if Lossberg even wrote one up. Hellyer was still actually in charge of drawing up plans, and relied on the full weight of the historical responsibilities of his office in order to authorize Marx's study. Comparatively, Jodl at OKW, while nominally the superior of the OKH, had none of the gravitas of Holder's position. His role, outside of specific tasks by Hitler, was much less well defined. Sometimes this was beneficial, allowing him to grab power in areas that were definitively outside of the domain of the army. Other times it was a handicap. This was one of those times. Lossberg could not receive the resources and staff to develop a complete operational plan, because his boss did not have them. Accordingly, Lossberg's plan was more truncated in detail than that of Marcks, even though he had access to the completed version of that plan. His mission was not to develop the operational plan of the Heer, but to keep Jodl informed of the possibilities that could be expected. Jodl needed ammunition for his power struggle with Hellyer, and Lossberg was to provide it. Of course, the entire point of the struggle was to influence the outcome of the planning process, and Lossberg's work did do that. The 3 army group disposition is indicative of his influence. The second key difference for Lossberg's plan was his evaluation of the logistics situation. He acknowledged that without capturing significant amounts of Soviet-gauge rolling stock, the strain on the trucks would be overwhelming. He also planned for as much supply as possible to be delivered through captured Baltic and Black Sea ports, and this too was eventually incorporated into the final plan. The third and final major difference between Lossberg and Marcks' studies was the identification of opportunities for local support among the people of the Soviet Union. The Baltic states were still in the process of being incorporated into the Union, and Stalin still faced significant opposition, albeit mostly unarmed. Ukraine was also identified as a potential source of support against the Soviets. All of these were possibilities, but they ignored the racial underpinnings of the Nazi state. They were engaged in an aggressive war of conquest. They were never interested in liberation, and the encouraging of local independence was anathema to a regime hell-bent on genocide and cultural domination of all non-German peoples. We will talk about this more in a moment, but first let's discuss the final iteration of the plan for the invasion of the Soviet Union. This final plan was organized and supervised by Lieutenant General Paulus. His mandate from Hellyer meant that it was his role to redefine the work done to this point, and he did so through comprehensive Wargames. He started these in December, which benefited from Hitler's clarified political direction through his war directives, and updated intelligence and force estimations from his compatriots on the OKH staff. His study centered on 3 army groups, like that in Lossberg's plan. One of Paulus's most important contributions was one that the other 2 men almost totally ignored. This was the force regeneration capabilities of the Red Army. Marcks and Lossberg had each assumed that the destruction of the main enemy forces, coupled with occupation of most of the developed areas of the Western Soviet Union, would preclude any rebuilding of the Red Army. Paulus was not so hopeful. He estimated that the Soviet Union could add 30 to 40 divisions to the main defense within the first 3 months of the war. These would come from newly mobilized conscripts and force transfers from other theaters. He further estimated that this would rise to 100 total new divisions within 6 months of the opening day. This was an unprecedented expansion that would have been hard for the Nazi state to comprehend. It had never been done in military history. To think that the Soviet Union could mobilize such forces in such a short time was impossible for many of the Nazi leaders. It ran counter to their entire ideological frame of reference, and yet, as we will see, the Red Army actually exceeded these numbers. In addition to this, Paulus's wargaming was also notable for revealing another key lesson, Neither of the flanking army groups, north or south, was strong enough to accomplish their objectives. This resulted in a major bulge along the front. Army Group Center would be far in advance of the north and south groups, with exposed flanks. To rectify this vulnerability, the two weaker groups would ask for panzer support. Such support would have to be granted, because Army Group Center would find itself unable to properly cover its flanks, crush its encircled enemies, and support its front. This weakening of the center led to a grinding halt of the advance on Moscow. The pause would give the Soviets time and space to organize more effective resistance. Paulus's conclusion was that the advance on the center had to be the main effort, regardless of other objectives. Moscow should be the singular objective of all three army groups. Perhaps there was simply no other reasonable conclusion, or perhaps Paulus understood that Hellyer would not soon accept any other conclusion. Hellyer was in the middle of his private struggle for influence over Hitler. He was desperate to convince Hitler of the Moscow above all else framing of the campaign. It is not clear whether Hellyer believed this was truly the best path to victory, or he was merely trying to convince Hitler of his strategic competency. The last thing we will go over for this week is the impact of the Nazi plans for genocide on the operational conditions for the invasion of the Soviet Union. In brief, these were fundamental to the entire Nazi conception of the war and its purpose. Only through war could Germany hope to gain the land the Nazis would insidiously term living space. This living space needed to be cleared of the peoples they considered racially inferior. This meant nothing less than genocide and ethnic cleansing, on a scale that, like everything else about the Nazi war plans, dwarfed anything else in history. General Plan East had its roots in Hitler's earliest ideas. On an operational scale, significant resources were dedicated to carrying out this insane plan. Einsatzgruppen formations were given a set priority within the Heer's logistics plans. They would follow in the wake of the frontline troops, murdering their way through the Soviet Union. They had the cooperation of many men and officers of the regular army, and occasionally their willing assistance. No one was to escape this war unscathed, physically, morally, or otherwise. This concludes our discussion for this week. Next week we will release our last Prelude episode that will talk about the concept of blitzkrieg and deduce whether it was real or not. Stay tuned, and remember, this is just the prelude to the weekly Eastern Front of World War II series. Don't forget to subscribe, comment and share this video, it helps immensely. We have started releasing weekly Patreon and YouTube member exclusive content. Consider joining their ranks via the link in the description or button under the video to watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.